very important one, but it's hard to build. The most successful one in the last 20 years was Samsung. They built that, but you know, the whole country is involved in trying to make that brand.
Of course, you have Taiwan Semiconductor,
Yeah.
which is a brand.
But that is still the is really now the
Consumer name.
Yeah, it's not a consumer name. You're right.
It's just also
Acer started, but it didn't. You know, it didn't stay.
Put lots of effort and lots of investment in, but not that successful.
Yeah.
The other day I was talking branding. I said, if you have brand, your gross margin will be very high. But if you like Acer is a 15% gross margin, that's I don't call that a brand. If you have branding, your gross margin is over 50% at least. Like Switzerland, they have lots of watch branding. And actually, you look at their watch, they made it cost $10,000 and they can sell for $100,000.
Here. I have a question which I meant to look up before I came here, and I forgot. When Hu Jintao came to Washington, D.C., you probably heard on the news that he had a private meeting with many of the American CEOs. And Steve Ballmer of Microsoft complained that the Chinese population only paid for 1 out of every 10 licenses that were sold in China. Now, my reaction to this was, well, you know, you went in there, and you wouldn't have gone in there if, number one, you didn't think you had to be in there, and number two, if you weren't making money on 1 out of every 10 licenses. But I didn't look it up. So I don't know if anybody knows the answer to that question, whether if they actually sell 1 out of every 10 licenses, do they actually make money, you know, out of 10? In other words, if they only sell 1 and, you know, the other 9 are bootleg, do they still make a profit? But with all the stuff that is made and all the creative energy in this country, with all you brainiacs here, that somebody cannot put something, you know, on this software that basically destroys it if it's a copy. Okay, now what is the story here? I mean, in department stores, they put tags and all kinds of stuff on stuff that destroys it if it, you know what I mean, if you try to take it off. Now, I just, somehow I can't get my head around this, that you can't destroy something if it's copied. Can somebody enlighten me on this? Because if the Taiwanese can't do it, nobody can. You guys are the best. And if it can be done, that would, you know, even though it's not something you buy directly, you sell it to somebody else, as usual, still your name would be on there. But it could be also that Microsoft is basically, you know, complaining about this and saying, oh, the Chinese should enforce it, which they know it's never going to happen. You know, it's kind of a joke complaint, like, I don't want my 12-year-olds to ever lie to me. You know, it's like, oh, well, okay, all right. Sure, we'll fix that. Okay, you know, it's sort of a crying to the wind.
In China, they use proud of themselves by using the copy product, you know.
Of course, of course. This is part of my speech tonight.
Oh.
The transparency thing, how we're talking past each other, you know. But it's a question. First of all, number one, do people know, does Microsoft make a profit just getting paid for 1 out of 10? Number two, what is this thing that they can't destroy something once it's copied? Anybody know?
I think they would make money out of those soft,
That's my, yeah.
the software, once it's developed, it really doesn't cost anything to pay. I think they just want to
Validate.
get the numbers of how many billion people use Microsoft. I think that's the reason, even though without enforcing it, I think they still want to have people. If they only sell a 10 million copy in China, I would think they still want to have the bootleg ones and so they can say it's 100 million people use it in China.
But that's not what the patent for or what the intellectual value is. Because they put a lot of time and money in the research and development. So the intellectual stealing is the main key issue dealing with in China. So what I'm thinking is that when we know this kind of data, the 1 out of 10 or 1 out of 100, this data will be collected, and then the government should tax all their products coming into this country. Import material, or tax them, say you steal so many intellectual property, and we want to tax them to the extent that we are satisfied. They always say, when we say something, they will say, just raise your yen value, your dollar value, your yen value, and then they say, under our term. They always creep under our term.
I agree with your argument.
The same thing. You will say, you steal so many intellectual material, we are going to tax them to the extent that we will satisfy under our term. Under U.S. term.
That's very ideal. I agree with her. You can never enforce that kind of things in China. It's just impossible. I mean, if you China, the government don't care. Okay, I think they're more concerned about intellectual. Actually, we don't talk about it. They take your Boeing plane apart. They try to duplicate that. Those type of things. I think those are intellectual. That it's going to damage. Future. Eventually, they don't want to buy Boeing things like that. But as a software, I think Microsoft, they just complain about it. It's all over the world. They duplicate this type of thing. It's just like movie industry. They make copies. You can't stop it. But it's very difficult for me to say take those things and try to become an economic war type of situation with it. But I think it's more dangerous because I remember my brother-in-law that they used to go to Boeing and they were actually copying the secret documents. And all the engineers was people like that would report to the senior management. And the senior managers turn their eye around, just let them do it because they can sell the airplane. I think that's much more dangerous than they copy a billion Microsoft window. I really, personally, I think that the behind the scene is much more serious.
I agree with you in principle, but I think it's like saying to a 10-year-old, I'm going to put a television set in your room. And here's a phone. Don't watch TV and don't talk on the phone. Okay? Good luck. If you really don't want them to watch TV and have the phone, take it out of their room. Microsoft made the decision to go into China, and I had this sense. That's why I asked the question. That they'd probably make money, but I didn't actually look it up. I'm not even sure if it could be found. And by looking, yeah. There's so many things you can't find on the internet. It's amazing. But my guess about it. But this goes to a point that I was going to make. I probably still will make tonight when we talk about transparency. which relates to all aspects, military, economic, interpersonal. And some of it relates to developed countries, some of it relates to cultural things, some of it relates to other things altogether. But the Taiwan nation has always been much more attuned to sort of Western philosophy. It's been the close relationship. It's much, you know, the Taiwan community, you know, the Taiwan American community, and Americans of Taiwanese descent, and they're just more sophisticated. Maybe, you know, maybe even they don't have the mentality that Chinese have, because they have not been over centuries immersed in the same culture that China did over centuries and centuries and centuries and centuries. But you know, Japanese are like this too, because they're generally from a Sino-centric, you know, beginning. Koreans are too. Many other cultures in Asia. So I'm not sure where it comes from. But when I watched President Obama and President Hu Jintao speak, three things struck me right away, just without thinking. First was that the questioner, one of the journalists, asked a question about human rights in China. And immediately President Obama started to deflect, because he's not trying to cause a problem right there. And President Hu didn't answer the question. And President Obama said, well, they're a developing country, and that, you know, he started to shuffle, and, you know, they're working on it, and, you know, of course we defend people's human rights, and blah, 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 blah. And President Hu didn't answer. And I immediately thought, you know, when the first Americans, and I'm not saying this is unique to America, when the first Americans came to the United States, they were subsistence farmers, you know, trying to get crops out of rocks or fertile land, depending. And they were immediately had a different philosophy, which was a democratic philosophy. And in fact, every charter the king gave for each colony was because the new colonists didn't like the last colony. The Massachusetts colony didn't like, you know, the people from Massachusetts colony didn't like the Massachusetts colony because they thought they were too autocratic, and they started more representative democracy in the next colony, and then there was more representative democracy in the next colony, and more. And these were poor people, you know, just as poor as the poorest person in rural China. So it had nothing to do with there being a developing country. And, you know, of course, nobody catches that. And so on the news, everyone kept repeating. Everybody was, you know, saying, oh yeah, they're a developing country. It had nothing to do with it. You know what I mean? But, you know, Americans are very sort of gullible. They don't think things through. Okay, they let it get away with it. And then President Hu later on was asked the question again, and he said, oh, I didn't know the question was addressed to me. Remember, did you hear that? And then he gave some reason.
Okay.
Then the second thing was, President Obama, when they talked about trade, was talked about again for the, you know, how many presidents of the United States have talked about this, a level playing field. And I thought I was going to start falling asleep. I mean, I only watched it because I felt I had to.